Hi everybody, thank you so much for coming out tonight. This is a very exciting evening for us. Aaron and Michelle, we're so thrilled that you're here in conversation to celebrate the release today of Black Utopians. So, we are Aaron Robertson. Oh, I forgot. You know, we just had 1 week where we did that events, and I'm totally But yes, so thank you everyone for coming out tonight. We are thrilled to welcome Aaron Robertson. He is a writer, editor, and translator of Italian literature, and his translation of, I'm going to... Thank you. Was shortlisted for the 2010 Translation Prize and the National Translation Award. And in 2021, he received the National Endowment of the Arts grant. And his work has appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, Foreign Policy, N+1, The Point, and Literary Hub, among other publications. And he lives in Brooklyn, New York, which makes us even that more grateful that you have come out here this evening. Thank you. And Michelle, our hometown person, Michelle Alexander, is a highly acclaimed civil rights lawyer, advocate, and legal scholar. She's a former Ford Foundation Senior Fellow and Soros Justice Fellow, and has clerked for the Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun, and has run the ACLU of Northern California's Racial Justice Project. The New Jim Crow is that rare first book that has received rave reviews and won many awards and prizes. It and Alexander have been featured in countless national radio and television media outlets. Alexander is a visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary and an opinion columnist for the New York Times. And you live in Columbus, Ohio. Not anymore. And we are so grateful. Please join me in welcoming them this evening.
Well, I am so thrilled that I had the opportunity to read your book and now actually be in dialogue with you about it. I will admit that I wasn't familiar with your work before I was introduced to your book, but it came to me highly recommended by people I admire and love, including Robertson. And I also have a long-standing interest in alternative communities and utopias for a bunch of reasons that is for another day. But I will say I was captivated immediately from the very first page by your, especially in the midst of dystopian realities. It was just a privilege and joy to engage with your work, so I hope everyone will pick up a copy. Yes. I think we all know that, utopia means different things to different people, and I think in our culture the word has somewhat of a negative connotation. It tends to be associated with fantasy, people being unrealistic, not pragmatic, being unwilling to face reality. But I tend to think that James Baldwin was speaking the absolute truth when he wrote to his nephew in The Fire Next Time, and he said, quote, "I know what I'm asking is impossible, but in our time, as in every time, the impossible is the least that one can demand. And one is, after all, emboldened by the spectacle of human history in general, and Black history in particular, for it testifies to nothing less than the perpetual achievement of the impossible." And so, reading your book, I was just blown away again and again by the ways in which the people you're describing have this acute sense that they are operating within this larger historical context, and that the future depends on them behaving in ways that the white mainstream may not understand, may think is utterly unreasonable, blasphemous, or even foolish. And many black folks as well. And yet they persisted and were anything but fools, however misguided some people might still think of them today. So I hope that you'll begin at the beginning of your book. I think Ruha Benjamin gets it exactly right in her endorsement when she says, quote, "In these pages, utopia is not fanciful and fleeting escapism, but the sweat-soaked soil of freedom dreams and fugitive imagination, nowhere and everywhere at once." In the very beginning of this book, you share two pieces about the Shrine of the Black Madonna, published in The Point in 2020. Both of those pieces were published right after George Floyd was murdered. But you had been thinking about and working on those pieces for more than a year, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
And so they were not quick responses to a wrenching and galvanizing moment. You wrote those essays after a lot of deep thought. And so I want you to take us way back, all the way back, not just to that moment, but where your thinking about utopias began, like the origin story, what drew you to the core question of the book, which you describe as, what does utopia look like in Black?
Well, first of all, this is such a dream event. I mean, thank you, Michelle, for all of your work and incredible advocacy, and also a special shout out to Jackie, and who's standing there in the back. Really organizing is a force of nature, and thank you all for being here. So I'm from Detroit, and this is the city I was born in. I had a complicated relationship with it growing up because I lived, my grandparents, my dad's parents lived there, and then I had my mom's parents who lived in the, suburbs. And I sort of grew up, shuttling back and forth between Detroit proper and the surrounding area. For much of my youth, I think I internalized a lot of the negative stereotypes that were propagated about Detroit, sort of depicted as this American dystopia, a place where progress had ended. There was nothing more to be said of its story, and it's like kind of a long personal journey that I was on to kind of to disabuse myself of those ideas, which I think was a reflection and part of internalized racism, actually. I grew up in a middle class Black family that had these very particular ideas of success and forward movement, and just kind of the problem of self-hatred was really real, I think, on some of my mom's side of the family. So part of my relationship with Detroit came through some reporting I did in the city in 2016 for this alt-weekly Detroit Metro Times. And one of the stories I worked on was about a community of artists and activists in the city who identified with, Afrofuturist thought. So there were musicians and architects and activists who believed that Detroit was actually a site of radical creativity, of insurgent politics. Its story was not over, in fact. And I think my interest in that community, in writing about spaces that I think largely been neglected in the mainstream, but locally were being tended to, was interesting to me. And soon after that, I took Ruha Benjamin's class, Black to the Future, which was this amazing, just kind of like a sociology and design class. It was just about like looking at every aspect of our society and surroundings and seeing the ways that, you know, everything was so intentional around us. And so fast forward, you know, 2019 comes around, I'm doing research for a novel project actually about, you know, Black Power Catholics in Detroit. It's kind of a very interesting time period. And I'm reading the memoir of a Black priest named Lawrence Lucas, who was based in Harlem. And he wrote a book called Black Priest, White Church, and he mentioned the name of this pastor in Detroit named Albert Clay Jr., who I had never heard of, you know, and I went to all kinds of churches growing up, and he was the pastor of a church called the Shrine of the Black Madonna. So I'm like, okay, well, I think I know the names of the Black Catholic churches in the city, but a quick search reveals that it was actually a Protestant church in Detroit. And eventually I learned about this Black, you know, it was a Black nationalist church. And they had a commune for children called Mtoto House. And I read a book by the woman in the church who ran this commune, and she described it as a model of education for Black children that was inspired by Bikabusim of Israel, Cuban liberation schools, Soviet Union kindergartens. And so I'm just like, okay. In the late 1960s and early 70s, there's a Black nationalist commune in Detroit, the American, you know, dystopia, right? And this is happening in a Christian church. Like, okay. So the novel stopped, and for the next 4 years, I started just dove deep into the meaning of the American counterculture, but through the experiences of Black Americans. I wanted to, you know, my paternal grandfather was born in an all-Black town in Tennessee called Promised Land, which is a little, it's like, there's like feed in this to me. And it was founded in 1870, and this was, you know, this town was where I would go as a kid, you know, every summer for family reunions. And so I was attuned, I think, on a very intuitive level to the creation of all Black spaces, of places of refuge and creativity and joy. And I wanted to draw a line between, you know, 19th century all Black towns, communes in the 1960s and 70s, and I wanted to see what those experiences had to say about the present.
Yeah, you know, it's, and you do it beautifully. I actually had marked a page I wanted to ask you about, and I didn't expect you to mention sort of the dimension of kind of self-hatred running through your family, or a strain of your family. I was very struck that Pastor Cleage had as a central kind of mission Black Christian nationalists as a prophetic vanguard that would secure the psychological liberation of Black people in addition to their material well-being, and that he viewed the psychological liberation as sort of a prerequisite to any kind of real freedom that Black people could attain. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about like what your understanding was of what he thought Black people needed to free themselves from psychologically, and whether there are resonances in your own family, if you would mind sharing.
Yeah. So just some background, you know, the Shrine of the Black Madonna is kind of the main community that I write about in the book, and it is not well known today by a lot of people, but in the late 1960s, it was known as perhaps the most radical Black Christian church in the country. You know, its pastor, Albert Clay, was known as one of the forerunners of what is now called, Black liberation theology, which in short is this idea that God is a God of the oppressed. Clay's his mission was to redefine the meaning of Christianity and to apply it to the everyday lives of Black people. And Clay is a kind of fascinating figure because he grew up among sort of Detroit's Black socialites. His dad was the first city doctor, the first Black city doctor hired by Detroit. Clay spent a brief period of time as a social worker in the city, and so he had a very clear view on kind of the contradictions within Detroit. He saw his own privilege, and he saw the lives of Black Americans on the east side of Detroit, which was a site that was terribly neglected. And so these were the foundations of much of his work throughout his life. The main kind of tenet of the movement he started, which is called Black Christian nationalism, which is a very different thing than white Christian nationalism. It's funny, I started writing, about the shrine in 2019, and then January 6th comes along, and I'm like, oh, I'm gonna have to explain that it's not just white Christian nationalism. But the tenet was that nothing is more sacred than the liberation of Black people. That was that was his mission and vision. And just as important for him and the members of his church, it was important to have land and to ensure that people's lives on earth were provided for, right? That they had housing and education. But equally as important was that African Americans be able to know that they were worthy, that they had dignity, that their lives did not always need to be defined by tragedy and sorrow. And I think the church is best known for, if you walk into the sanctuary in Detroit, the first thing you see is an 18-foot tall, 9-foot wide mural of a Black Madonna and Child. And it was painted by a revolutionary Black nationalist named Glanton Dowdell. And that mural, I think, became a sort of visual affirmation for so many people that they were sacred in a way, right? That everything that society had tried to reinforce about them, everything that society had told them about themselves, did not need to be so, And if the foundations of Christianity could be overturned in a way, if the mother of Christ could be Black, then maybe the foundations of all reality, could be overturned. Maybe the political systems that structured our lives, the economic systems that structured our lives, maybe they didn't need to be that way. And I think at the root of sort of Black utopianism is this notion that the restrictions that have historically been imposed on Black Americans can be battled, can be challenged in really radical, creative ways.
I actually went to Detroit about a decade ago and got a tour of Detroit from the Fog Center.
Oh, yeah.
And I so struck when I was there. I mean, it was at the time, there's been a lot that's gone on in Detroit over the last decade. In fact, I was just there again several months ago. But when I was there, folks in the Bog Center gave me and others like a tour of some of the most devastated neighborhoods, places where neighborhood after neighborhood, block by block, abandoned, decimated, right along with the factories that had once sustained those neighborhoods. And in the midst of all that, there were also people who were planting organic gardens, who were squatting in abandoned buildings and organizing self-defense networks, and were in their own ways kind of planting the seeds of utopian communities that were existing outside of the city structure, really any other form of government structure, and viewed themselves in many ways as pursuing something like a utopian vision arising out of dystopia. And I was so moved by what I heard and saw and learned while I was there, but also just the image of just this absolute utter destruction. It looked like the apocalypse had come and went, and then people farming on these abandoned lots and singing and tending to their children. And so I'm wondering what it was like for you personally, having been raised in Detroit and kind of coming upon this utopian alternative that had once been so controversial and influential and inspirational for so many, and whose leader was kind of preaching, teaching things that were directly relevant in some ways to you and your own family life. Like, what did that mean to you, and why did that inspire you, that discovery, to kind of go on this journey and write this book?
Yeah, I think the beginning of any utopian exploration is always very personal. I think it begins with this question. It begins with a speculative question, which is what if? What if I were somebody else? Or what if I had been somebody else? What if the conditions of my upbringing had been different? And I think I didn't grow up going to Black nationalist churches, I'll say that. Many of the communities I was a part of did not emphasize, political and social involvement as much as the Shrine of the Black Madonna did. On the one hand, I grew up sort of taking this sense of ingrained community for granted, and I was surrounded by supportive people who really loved me, and I loved them. But I can't say that I grew up learning extensively about Black history or about the importance of being engaged with the world around me. And to be frank, I for a long time, struggled to. I struggled with my identity as a Black person, like in this country, right? Like I felt that I was sort of lacking the kind of confidence and pride that so many of the young people who grew up in the church had felt when they were younger. And for the book, I spoke to many of the people who grew up in the church, who are still a part of it, and some who left. And the kids who are now adults who grew up in Toto House, all say, as complicated as that experience was for many of the children, they always had this community that carried them throughout their entire lives. They always knew what they were worth, That was not in doubt. And regardless of what was happening in the world around them, that was something that they could return to. And I think, as I grew older and as I grew apart, I grew distant from the Christianity of my youth. As I grew apart from the church, I also kind of lost that community. And I think I have always been trying to find or create some approximation of that feeling of safety and community that I'd had as a child. So a real kind of central tension of the book, I guess, is this back and forth between the beauty of individualism and, I should say, individuality and communalism at different points, like having either, and having too much of either is not good. But finding the balance of that within your life, I think, is what so many people, but so many utopians and dreamers are striving for.
Yeah, the book really is part memoir. Like, your story is embedded in it as you tell. Also the stories of these other utopians who were pursuing their dreams. And at one point you write, when I set out to tell this story, I thought I might be like one of those inconspicuous narrators of old travelers' tales who are shipwrecked upon the shores of an impossible land, or who awaken to discover a strange new world of which they can never be fully a part. But then at some point you realize that you can't be just a curious outsider. How did the process of writing this book kind of change you? One of the things that really struck me also while reading was the research that you did, interviewing people who were part of the Shrine, part of the Christian nationalist movement back in the 60s and 70s, and who are still alive today, and who were either active in or skeptical of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about what you learned from them, if their views had changed, if there's anything surprising, but also if and how you may have changed in the process of writing the book.
I think when I had written the 2 essays that the book was based on for a magazine, I was so eager to lean into history, to have that kind of speak for itself. I was very against the idea of writing a personal story. And I think that is partly just a result of my own personality, kind of a private person. And I also think it's hard to write compellingly about one's own life, and I just think that history is much more interesting. But all my editors and friends, and Brianna back there who read the book, they all said, "Aaron, this is so clearly a personal story. You gotta stop hiding behind history." And that was right, but all, and I think the way I convinced myself to lean into that more is to, I had to understand that on one hand, I think the history of utopian thought and experimentation, it does include those grand, large-scale plans to transform society and to completely change the world as we know it. But every utopian community, every utopian movement is made of individuals, is made of very specific people with specific needs and goals, And I wanted to write something that, I think of this book in a way as a kind of brief biography of Black Americans, like wants and needs. Throughout time, what are the things that different communities have really wanted, so I think in speaking to members of the shrine, I came away with a greater sense of urgency in terms of like needing to or wanting to create a community that helped sustain me, but which I could also, contribute to in some way. I think I was, I don't know. I think a part of me is a little too ready to kind of be apart or to keep myself apart from other people. But it is that kind of the open-heartedness of the people that I spoke to made me want more of that. I always lose track of questions. So
That's good. I was moved by how you opened the book with your father. Your father was incarcerated, and he had a practice of writing letters to you. Maybe you could just share a little bit about your father, the letter writing, and why you asked him to write more letters that you could incorporate into the book, and what the relationship is really between your father's letters and his thinking and the themes of the book.
Yeah, my dad is a really large part of the book. He was incarcerated from the time I was 8 until I was 18, and while he was in prison, my grandparents and I would often visit him in Michigan, and we would exchange letters. And this was especially true when I was younger. And as time went on, life happens, and I, on one hand, felt my own life sort of moving forward in a way, and I think the foundations of our relationship the foundations did not feel broad in some way or very secure. And at a certain point, when I was maybe in high school, I actually I lost the original letters that he had written to me, which I think in a way was a sort of reflection of our kind of complicated relationship. When he got out of prison, when I was a freshman in college, for many years we started to kind of build some kind of relationship, but he lived in Ohio, he lived in Columbus for a bit, and then in Texas, so we were always distant still. But I knew that like he was such a dreamer, he always had goals outside of, he had goals for what his life would become outside of prison, and also he was so fascinated by the life that he could have lived if circumstances had been different. And I knew that he was a brilliant writer as well, because he had written a short story for me while he was in prison, and it was stunning. And I knew that he wanted to share his story, especially with younger Black men who had been incarcerated. So in 2020, as I was conceiving of the book, I asked my father if he would write a new series of letters for the book that talked about his past, but talked about the life that he would have wanted for himself, but also the life that he had now and what his hopes were for the future. I think that as many differences as there are between my father and I, one thing we share is this like obsession or obsession with what could have been. And that interest is always at the root of utopian thinking. And so, yeah, he's a big part of the book. His writing is really beautiful, and I wanted that personal thread to sort of be a more intimate way to experience the broader story that I was telling.
So what's your hope that readers will take away from the experience of reading your book? What is it that you most hope that they will learn, come to understand, the experience you want them to have just reading it? What's your greatest hope?
There's always been so much creativity in movement building and in attempts to create a better world. And these attempts tend to be ignited actually in moments of great disaster. So, like I was already thinking about the shrine when COVID came and when George Floyd was murdered, and I was attuned to the stories in the news. I was thinking about Black Utopian activity and initiatives, and so when all that stuff was happening, I was reading the news for those kinds of attempts, right? I was reading about the creation and spread of mutual aid networks that were popping up throughout the country, reading about the sort of importance of food sovereignty networks that were so crucial for so many communities. And like one of the major food security networks in the country is in Detroit. And so at all the times we read about despair and suffering, it's always paired with a real sense of hope, I think, and not blind hope, but a kind of pragmatic hope, right? And that impulse has always been here, and so I hope that people will come away with that understanding, and then on a more personal level, all the stories about ruin porn in Detroit, which is this idea that it tends to be artists who go to Detroit to photograph dilapidated structures and circulate those, and that's the narrative. I kind of wanted to help put an end to that. And I want to encourage people, reporters, etc., who write about Detroit, to emphasize the people that are there and not the buildings.
Yes, absolutely. And it was certainly the thing I was most moved by was not the horror of the ruins, but what's happening in the midst of them, what people were actually doing and how they were responding creatively. So I would love to, I know we're ready for Q&A, so I'd love to hear what other folks have to add to it. Thank you again for writing.
Questions?
I happen to have lived in Detroit.
Oh, amazing.
Next Tuesday, I'll be 8 miles and more.
Oh, great. I love
See
it.
pretty well. Went to historically black college at the Grand Virginia State. Ended up going to work for General Motors and going to grad school, University of Michigan. I am placed in a town called Pontiac, Michigan. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, of course.
And I walk in the cafeteria, and nobody will speak to me. Like I'm a leper. And it goes on for like about a month. No one communicates. So I'm realizing that there's something wrong here. And I finally figured out what it was. August 31st, 1971, Do you know what happened in Pontiac, Michigan?
Oh no, the pop quiz. I'm so bad at pop quiz.
It was the largest mass school bus burning in America. I says, now I get this. So anytime you have plant and plantation is the same word. So all the folks in Detroit are working on either the Ford plantation, General Motors plantation, or Chrysler's plantation.
Oh man, yeah.
And it's an emotional drain on people that are from that region. And Henry Ford, Walter P. Chrysler, okay, Alpha P. Sloan, recruited certain people to work in the factories. Henry Ford was the last to unionize. He brought folks from the South to cross the picket lines with axe handles. A black man with an axe handle. That's a dangerous combination coming there into Detroit. And as I learned the people, I didn't stay long. I just had a contract to stay in Michigan for a period of time. And it gave me an understanding of how certain people control and why. Each different school district in Detroit got city funding, but it was dispersed individually. So certain school districts didn't receive the same funding as other regions. Am I right or wrong?
Yeah.
So I started breaking all this down. And the educational level was, we don't want folks here that are very intelligent. That's a threat. I go back to Detroit 10 years later. I'm interviewed by one of the Fords. He says, oh no, someone says we can't have him work here. He doesn't quite fit. He doesn't understand the word Ford means power here. And the people have been working under this plantation, black and white, for generations. And you can't change the spirit of the people. Only person we know that escaped that was Eminem. And 8 Mile in Hoover, right? So it's understanding the spirit of what happens and why the constant dissension, people by cultures, Hamtramck, it's all Germans. Each different area doesn't even associate with each other.
Yeah, the auto industry and its role in Detroit is an important part of the book, but in kind of in like maybe an unexpected way. So Albert Clay Jr. was he was a critic of the way that so many auto companies were run, and you know he was afraid that automation would make black workers obsolete. And I think a part of so many utopian traditions is, I mean, we go back to Manchester, England. It's the threat of the factories. The Industrial Revolution is going to transform our society, going to make us automatons, you know. And so a major part of Clay's activism and ministry was also related to anti-capitalism, you know, to the sort of organization of labor and time that had ruined, you know, so many black communities and you know, had created these lives of work that were very extractive, you know, and that, you know, benefited the Fords. And you know, I went to school in the neighborhood where the Fords mansions, you know, were, and so and then you looked across the street, across Alter Road, and you see the empty houses, right? So that contrast is deeply felt in Detroit. Of course, my grandfather moved up from Nashville to get a job at Ford. He, you know, cut glass, and so it's hard to escape the ubiquity of the factories. And I think that one of the common narratives that is, you know, talked about is Detroit Motor City, a major hub for Black American workers, and that's certainly true. but also there was a dark side to that. Yeah, so thank you for sharing your own experience.
Detroit has some very dark sides.
Well, I actually grew up between those two cities, Chicago and Detroit. And it wasn't until I read Michelle's work that I understand why the book was wrote for Black men, that actually described my experiences, being on the privileged side of that. Because as they moved the industries out, they moved it in our areas. And I grew up in a time when there was factories everywhere. And a lot of white people would ask, like, well, why don't you guys just get a job? But I can tell you, working in those factories, it's soul crushing. And I think that was the word he was looking for. But when you look at what you've written, does the ideas, the notions, because when you speak, when you start speaking the language, you've already inherited 2,500 year history of interpreting the world. You inherited a metaphysics and ontology, the whole nine, Does the word utopia or Christian paradise or black, is that enough for someone who, it seems more like you're yearning for being an individual?
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. Well, it's funny because when you describe somebody as utopian, like even if their way of thinking or the way that they engage with the world is inspired and shaped by so many other utopian movements throughout time, most people don't accept that term or label. In fact, Albert Clay described himself as a pragmatic realist, right? Like he actively disliked the word utopian,
Capitalism itself had a history of being a utopia.
Yeah,
Breaking away from kingships.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think in writing the book, I wanted to kind of explore or reclaim some of the more, I guess, positive connotations of this idea of utopia. Like in a way, it's a neutral term. I think there can be very positive utopian experiments and many disastrous experiences of utopia as well. But I guess I wanted to write something that explored both the sort of highs and lows of this. And so one part of the book, which actually, like, we should talk more. I'm curious to hear your experience in childhood, but I write about Jonestown, actually, which, the People's Temple had a largely black congregation, and Jim Jones himself, he was a white man, but he was influenced by many black charismatic preachers, and in fact, in his most incendiary moments, identified himself as a black man, a black god of a sort. And so when I was in the archives in Michigan, I saw letters from members of the People's Temple who had written to Albert Clay Jr. because like in the shrine, there was a painting of a Black Messiah. And you see these letters of people asking Clay for pictures of the Black Messiah because their pastor was, he had adopted, he had a multiracial family, and he wanted peace and harmony for the world, and like People's Temple was a socialist experiment, and in fact, a part of the reason why the shrine is not a better known institution today is because even at the time, like in the late 60s and 70s, it was often conflated with some of the more kind of the violent cults and utopian communities, right? And there's a fine line, I think, between disaster and radical transformation. So utopia means all of that, I think.
Yeah, but I think the general point I was trying to make is that, you can have capitalism, socialism, communism, you can encounter the same situation where everybody works, produces, and very few benefit, and they're just using different words. That's what I'm saying.
Perhaps, maybe.
Yeah, ideology.
Hi, I'm really, I love the artwork, so I was curious as to who was the artist and also what inspired the woman that's here.
So the actual cover was made by portraitist Barclay Hendricks. He was well known for his portraits in the 1960s and 70s. And this is actually, it's not Angela Davis. As many people think. It's his second cousin. Her name is Kathy. He's not part of the book, but I think the reason why it's so compelling for this project is because the artist who I do write about, Glanton Dowdell, who painted the Black Madonna and Child, this contrast, I think, of very earthly, everyday people and kind of sacred imagery was something that reflected, I think, the mission of Clegg's movement of the Shrine of the Black Madonna. And if you buy the book, you'll see words. Or you could go to a library and get it. There are a lot of paintings in the book. There are some by Glanton, but most of the paintings are done by Glanton Dowdell's daughter. She made the artwork in the book. And so it was very important for me to write not only about the politics and religion and activism, but art, and the kind of foundational role of art in these attempts to make a better world. But Barclay Hendricks is amazing. It's so cool.
I have a question about the church, the Shrine of the Black Madonna. What was the reform that they were trying to achieve? Social reform.
Everything. Clay was not only upset with the sort of the consequences of white American Christianity and its complicity in just about every major crime in U.S. history, but he was also really mad at prosperity gospel, black prosperity gospel preachers who he saw as duping their congregations, and these people who use their charisma to get money. He was a staunch critic of this acquisitiveness and greed. He was and so he saw that problem throughout American churches generally. He also knew that the church was such an important historical base for so many black movements, right? Like this was the hub of politics, and this was these were the birthplaces of so many important movements. So he didn't want to completely leave the church behind. He actually saw it as the major launching pad for black social movements in the future. But he did want to transform what Christianity looked like, and he wanted to make sure that it was always relevant to the times and to the lives of black people. He was not kind of a Sundays only preacher, but he wanted Christianity to be something that you felt and enacted in your everyday life.
Hi. I'm thinking about a black utopia. So if there were a black utopia, okay, I would think that it might be Detroit, okay, because of the opportunities for black people in the early 60s with the auto industry, but also Motown came out of Detroit. And so that's what I'm thinking of, and not that it was necessarily a Black utopia, but I think in the 60s, there was a lot of hope for Black people. And we need sort of different life of real hope. And also, I just want to ask you to mention, you mentioned Father Lucas. Now, I lived in Harlem, so I know the name, Father Lucas. And I know that he went to the prisons. So
Right.
that's what I know about Father Lucas.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I think he died in 2020.
I lost touch.
Yeah.
So I really don't know, but I know that he had he was in Harlem.
That's right. Oh.
Father Lucas was invited to celebrate Mass at St. Peter Claver. You know that, you live in town, you know St. Peter Claver? It was started by our Colombian Catholic priest, but not that church, but, you know, working with slaves. And so, it's a very, I'm not Catholic anymore, I can't be Catholic anymore. I'm Catholic, I'm Puerto Rican Catholic. Rome is something that exists for white people. I loved his speech, I thought it was so great, and I even wrote the note to the white pastor, and said, wow, this is wonderful, this is great. And the next week at Mass, and there's a handful of white people there, and they give most of them, and there's plenty of affluent blacks here, I'm not clear, and I'm Puerto Rican. They were just so critical that, of this black man that, and his sister was a nurse, she worked for the diocese. They lived in a brownstone that their parents left them, so they weren't poor. But why they became religious, I don't know. But anyway, it was that the world ain't ready for anything black and progressive, because he was similar to what I think this progressive, utopian thinking black minister was. And I'm surprised, I didn't think that Protestant churches had images. Everybody, any Protestant that I know tells me I'm not a Christian because the Catholic Church has statues. And I say like, what? You believe in Christ? And then I know you're not Christian, you're just Catholic. You were first. And then I say, I'm either gonna kill everybody, or I'm gonna have to just shut up.
No, it's true. Like most Protestant churches did not have it. That's why the shrine was so controversial. People called they were heretics, like they were crazy. You know. So yeah, that's exactly right.
So I'm an online Catholic according to myself. Okay, that's all I have.
We have one more here.
Yeah, hi.
Oh,
First of all, thank you so much for
Sorry.
I'll just be loud, I'm playing loud. Just want to say thank you so much for just sharing so much of your artistry and your process with us. This has been just so eye-opening. I am a designer and a burgeoning experience designer and an environmental designer with goals of one day opening such a Black utopia. And I've been doing a lot of research for a while now, kind of in between speculative fiction and Afrofuturism and emergent strategy and, you know, the real ones out there, and whom I feel as though you are absolutely a part of. And I wanted to ask from your experience in doing all this research that has led you to it, and I love the questions that were like, you mentioned something in the book that was like, I thought I could just be like an omniscient narrator kind of from the outside in, but I found myself further and further realizing how to, you know, kind of to quote the Combahee river flood, the personal is political, and et cetera, and so when you're talking about something so large, it makes so much sense to go small, and in the details you find the universal. So it's a roundabout way of, basically one of the 35 questions I wrote down was, okay, so first of all, in speaking towards like the religious element and the, like, how did you find like any of the things that you researched or the various Black utopias through the decades, through life, in both imagined or real or attempted or failed or succeeded, how did you find the most successful ones navigated, sort of like the fact that we're not a monolith when it comes to spirituality, when it comes to religion. There's the secular, there's the spiritual, there's the deeply religious, and as we're watching, in many ways what feels like end of times happening, I feel like we're seeing a lot of people return to versions of spirituality that maybe, like you were saying, I also didn't necessarily grow up consistently going to Black church, though when I did, I was always, I felt very at home just in the community of it all, even though the religion itself was not hugely for me as a queer woman. But yeah, like how do you think we could find the best ways from a design perspective of bringing people together across barriers of like religious affiliations and or political affiliations, class affiliations, and how do you think is the best way to involve the community we hope to serve in making those decisions, like about what that space looks like and feels like?
Yeah, I love that question, thank you. I think one way to answer, and I'll use the story of the shrine to be specific, but one of the challenges of any utopian movement is how much to transform over time. That was one of the kind of core, when Albert Clay died in 2000, that was one of the it was a hard moment for his church, because you had many people who wanted to hold on to the Black Power mentality, and who thought they still wanted to be a Black nationalist church in the 21st century. And then you had others who said, well, the world is changing, the world has changed. We need, in order for our movement to survive, we need to adapt with the times, we need to be fluid. And this was a process that was starting to happen, like even in the 1980s, right? Like the shrine began as a very explicitly Black nationalist church, and then even by the mid-1970s, actually, the church began to, its philosophy began to resemble in some ways what we think of as like New Age spirituality, right? I mean, the Black theology of the church was inspired by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and other sort of mystics, and so I think Clay himself was someone who always said that this can't always be a Black Power church, this can't always be a Black nationalist hub, because the world is globalizing, and our youth want to see what the wider world is like. The state of Black revolutionary movements has shifted because so many have been, dismantled like very actively, and so I think that one way to answer that in terms of how to design these kinds of spaces, to a certain extent, it's like trying to find a balance of, okay, how do we speak to people's like spiritual and emotional needs now, right? It's a shift in framework and language in a way that our country has become. We are an increasingly secular country. Like younger Black people in particular are moving away from the religion of like our grandparents. But there is still a spiritual need for people, like we're also spiritual seekers in our own way. And I think, like you have seen those shifts take place gradually. And so it's about how to keep things updated, right? Like if the church is not working for you, or if the way a movement is lived is not working for you, then you kind of have to address yourself to the needs and desires of the very particular group of people or community that you want to transform. That's all very generalized, but I do think that's kind of that is like a pattern that I've noticed in reading about these movements. The ones that lasted the longest, in a way, found a way to adapt to a certain extent to the time.
The responsiveness.
Turn marks.
I know we have more questions, but I think we would like to have time for you to sign books and for people to visit. Thank you so much for this really.
Thank you all.
And so before, a little housekeeping, but first of all, I want to say, I think for many of the people in this room that I know, all seem to be searching for utopia, so thank you for sharing your story of the history. But I also want to thank you all for your donations tonight towards the James Howe House. James Howe was the first African American in Montclair to own a home. He was previously enslaved to the Crane family of Montclair in the early 1800s. James was manumitted and willed $400 and 6 acres of land, including the home that still stands at 369 Claremont Street. So in the summer of 2022, the Friends of Howe House was formed to save and preserve this historic home. So the funds will go to keep going. Thank you all. Chairs first so that people can get their books signed. There's plenty of food. We're going to have a cake. We invite you all to join in and stay and chat. Thank you very much.
You know what? You have access to them. You go. There you go. Somebody needs to keep this page.
Oh my gosh, it's too pretty.
I know.
It's too pretty.
Mary needs to come and cut this. Okay, who wants cake? Somebody has to take the first piece.
I'll take it.
Yay! Yeah, we're going for a walk tomorrow morning, Missy. There you go. Here's a fork.